This is Jeff Miller of A Dash of Insight, continuing our series of the analysis of each of the recessions one by one with Bob Dealey, the creator of Mr. Model. Bob, I think we're up to the double dip recession in the 80s.
Yes, Jeff, and this is part of the case where interpreting the model and is helpful, but also a reminder that it is part art and part science. As you can see on the chart, the aggregate spread went through 200 basis points actually early in 1979. And this was a reflection both of the monetary policy that had been adapted. You and I both recall when Chairman Volcker shifted the way that they were fundamentally going to manage monetary policy, in which they began to target not so much the level of interest rates as the quantity of money that was going to be allowed to circulate. The end result of all of this was to have a severely inverted yield curve. And we also have, again, lost in the mists of history the fact that the Fed funds rate went to 20%. We think about today when it's less than 1, but those of us can remember when it was a number with a 20 handle on it. And this is when a completely different set of practices. But the long and the short of it is what you see in that interval between the period where the aggregate spread went through 200 and when it emerged from 200, we actually had two different recessions. The very short recession of 1980, which lasted 6 months, and then a recovery period in between that lasted only 12 months. The aggregate spread in that period went negative, stayed negative, although as you can see if you drop down into that recovery interval, it did turn up before it then again turned down. And this to me was one of the most valuable pieces of information. It said that we were in the process of a recovery and then policies were put in place that ensured a second recession.
You're talking about right here,
That's
where it
correct.
went up and then down again.
Right. But it stayed negative during that entire period. The message being we were never out of the woods from the 1980 recession.
So even though the NBER technically called this as two different recessions,
It really wasn't, at least in my estimation, but I'm not the arbiter, they are.
mhm,
And so we have to go with the fact that they called it two recessions. And from the standpoint of what the model was telling us is that as we came out of the 1980 recession, we did indeed see some indications that a recovery might be getting underway. What we then subsequently found out is that the Fed took steps in terms of further increases in the Fed funds rate that led to another downturn that lasted 16 months. We do, however, notice that as the aggregate spread is turning north in 81 and early 82, that the trough of 1982 is clearly signaled, and that it would have been at that point that we would have expected the economy to emerge from recession, and it did. And this had major implications for how the economy would perform over the next two cycles, which we can talk about in another episode.
so I guess we would have to say, as a potential consumer of Mr. Model, that this was a pretty early signal
It
in this
was.
case. Were you actually telling, um, you were at the Northern Trust at the time, were you forecasting
Actually, I was
a
at
re-
Continental at the
or I'm
time,
sorry, you're at Continental at this time?
and we actually did forecast the double dip. Did not
Mm-hmm.
make the bankers happy at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you for that explanation of the 80s, and we'll move on to the 90s in our next segment.